And welcome, everybody. This is Apollo Detectives Part 6. Yes, we're back again. Oh, some of these faces you'll recognise because they're faces who've been on before. We've also got some new faces. It's going to be a bit different, this one, I think, and it should stand out a little bit, so I'm looking forward to that. So if we'll just bring in some of the people that are on tonight, just one at a time, ask them just briefly to introduce themselves. By the way, I should introduce myself. I'm Ben Emlyn Jones, and I have been a part of Apollo Detectives since it first started, and it's really, really great to still be a part of it. It's great to be here this evening with you all. So first things first, we have the welcome return of Scott Henderson. He's back again. Hi, Scott. How you doing?
Yes, good evening, New York time. I'm calling from Canada. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I hope we have a good show.
Oh, it's great to have you back, Scott. Also from Canada, we got a new face. So he's not been on before, but he's an author, and he's written an interesting-looking book. I actually have a copy of it. I've not read it yet, sorry, but it's actually Randy Walsh. So, Randy, welcome to the Apollo Detectives. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Ben, and hello to everyone over there. And just you wanted me to give a little bit of background of who I am. Let's see, my background is in aviation. I started off with private license, went up to commercial, then multi-engine rating, then instrument rating, and then I added a flight instructor class 3 rating to that. So I've been teaching people how to fly. So I teach the ground school, and I teach them how to fly in the air. So that's been kind of fun.
I think Marcus Allen, who is back again. I think you have been on you are our most regular Apollo detective. I think we have to call you Chief Inspector. You know, you've been on all of them, haven't you?
Obviously, at some point you'll say, we don't want that Marcus anymore. He's completely
When people get bored of you, we'll do that, Marcus, but that hasn't happened yet, so welcome back. And now we should go to one of our producers. It's Andrew Chaplin. Hi, Andrew, how are you?
Hello, Ben. How's your COVID-19 situation? Has that kind of disappeared now?
I've still got this lingering cough. You know, I have got over it, and of course, I've just found out that two of the guys I used to serve with in the hospital have passed away, sadly. It's just very upsetting, yeah. And now we're going to move to another newcomer to the Apollo Detectives. It is Blue Earth Thing. Now, Blue Earth Thing has a YouTube channel, and if you want to know what it is, it's very simple because it's that name. And so, Blue, welcome to the Apollo Detectives. I think you're going to be probably our most unusual guest because you have a different opinion, I think, to the rest of us. So we'll look forward to hearing now. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Blue Earth Thing, and like you said, I have a small YouTube channel in which I just post various videos about sometimes rockets, sometimes I go on and talk about conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. I'm actually the only one on the show, I think, that believes that we landed on the moon.
So far.
And my background in this stuff is not anything spectacular. I'm not an expert, anything like that. I just casually enjoy studying some space here and there.
We have, once again, Trevor Weaver. He's an author as well. So, Trevor, welcome back. It's good to see you. I think it's your third visit to Apollo Detective, isn't it?
Yeah, probably. 3.5 of that. My background, if someone was interested, I started a software company in 1969, interestingly. I had that until 1979, and then I went off and I was a United Nations diplomat for the remainder of my career. I retired at 49 years old.
Well, finally this evening, last but not least, we have our another producer. It's Neil Geddes-Ward. Hi, Neil.
Hello. Hi, Ben. Hi, everybody. It's good to have another Apollo Detective so quickly. So it's this is the second one within about 2 weeks. So that is obviously because we're allowed to do it because we have this freedom at home time now, so that we've got lots of time to play. Scott had found lots of interesting things in his research that inspired me to have a dig deep in some of these lunar photography things, and I found a few interesting things of late as well.
Randy put his hand up first. So go ahead, Mr. Walsh, and give us your presentation and we'll discuss it.
I think what really got my attention was 20 years ago. I happened to just come in from work one evening, turned on the TV, and it just happened to be a documentary. Now, at the time, I didn't realize what mission they were talking about. It was an Apollo mission. But then I heard them talking about the need to use the moon as a gravity assist. I knew right away that was Apollo 13. I knew that much at that time. And then I realized the commander, Jim Lovell, was talking about their method of navigation. And what he was saying is that they were sort of talking about their conversation in the lunar module cockpit. They needed to make a course correction. So what he was talking about was how the interaction between him and the other astronaut was, okay, He was instructing him that no matter what you do, when you get full power, keep the Earth within a grid pattern on the window. Now, I specifically remember him saying the grid pattern on the lunar module window. Now, that scene was actually depicted in Ron Howard's movie Apollo 13. But that's not exactly what the official version says. But that was actually done more for dramatics. What he was really talking about was that they were actually looking through the optics. Now, for those of you who don't know what the optics are, that was the part of the navigation system that they used to look through to get star sightings, so as they can then interface with the Apollo guidance computer and get a position fix. So what that told me at that point is that they were using a combination of computer assist with visual assist. Now, for those of you that don't know much about navigation, when you're using visual clues, you're not getting a lot of precision. Now, the reason why they had to use the optics, by the way, to get a position fix was for a simple reason: when keeping the Earth within a grid pattern. Of course, at that point, they had moved from the command module into the lunar module during the Apollo 13 crisis. You know, the explosion, the oxygen tank explosion, so on and so forth. And when they had swung around the moon and needed to use that as, remember, they were in an elliptical orbit. They were on a free trajectory back, and they were going to use the lunar module engine because, remember, the command module and the service module were powered down due to the explosion. So they had moved into the lunar module. So when he was talking about how they have to fire up the lunar module engine, and then they'd have to do a visual check to make sure that the Earth was in a grid pattern in the optics, that to me sounded very precarious. And that was my very first indication that something wasn't right here in terms of navigating. As a pilot, when you're using visual clues, it's actually a form of dead reckoning. So you're using dead reckoning navigation. You're not talking a lot of precision here, and it doesn't take long for you to be off course. To use that kind of method to get yourself 240,000 miles away from the moon back to the Earth is precarious, to say the least. I mean, if you're off by 0.01 degree, you could find yourself 100, if not thousands of miles off course. So that was my first my doubt. That was the first time I actually started having doubts, because I thought that was a little bit peculiar given the sophistication that we were led to believe that they were using in terms of getting there and back. I really didn't pay much attention after that, but then about 10 years ago, I started looking into it a bit more. You know, I started reading all the books. And when I mean books, I'm talking about books that support the Apollo moon missions. So I'm looking at books by space historians. You know, the one that Marcus has, I actually have a similar one. So I was looking at books like that. Also looking at the how Apollo flew to the moon. So we're not talking conspiracy books yet, although they are important. I'm talking about books that are in support of the missions. And that led me into the situation with the Saturn V rocket. Now, for those of you out there that don't know, the Saturn V rocket was the most powerful rocket ever built, liquid fuel rocket ever built. Just to give a little bit of a brief description, the Saturn V rocket had 3 stages. So you had the first, second, and third. Now, the first stage, the most important one, carried the 5 F-1 engines. Now, the F-1 engines are the most powerful engines ever produced. So that is according to NASA. Now, each engine produced thrust of approximately 1.5 million pounds. So that's a total of about 7.5 million pounds total thrust. Now, that thrust was needed to propel the 46-ton payload to 42 miles, according to NASA. So about 2 minutes after launch, about 42 miles. It needed to reach that altitude in order to reach its optimum orbit. The first stage separation of the Saturn V rocket would take place at 42 miles. And, of course, then the J2 engines in the second stage would take over and then help boost it up to an Earth parking orbit. Okay, so I came across some very interesting things about the Saturn V. I'll get into the testing aspect shortly. But I came across some articles in my reading, and which led me to the Ollis.com website. And there was one article in particular that I'd like to quote, and it's by a scientist by the name of Gennady Avchenkov, if I pronounced that correctly. So it's a Russian scientist, and that was translated into English for the Ollis website. And he did a very, very mathematical prose on the Saturn V F-1 engines. And it's a 60-page article. It makes some very tough reading. It's very mathematical, so it's very difficult. It takes a lot to navigate around it. But the basic premise is that he said that the F-1 engines were not producing the thrust that was necessary to propel the payload into low Earth orbit. And if you can't propel the payload into low Earth orbit, then you're definitely not going to have an Apollo moon landing. So he went through step by step by step. Basically, what he was saying is that the F-1 engines had to be powered back, and they had to be powered back for the simple reason that they couldn't operate at full power, because to operate at full power, they would have a total breakdown of the cooling system. So briefly, I'm going to explain the cooling system so to give the viewer a little better understanding of what it is that Chenkov was talking about. So looking at the F-1 engine, we were talking about temperature in the combustion chamber to get up to 5,000 degrees Celsius. So what they need to do is to keep that engine cool, because obviously if you're not going to keep that engine cool, you're going to have an explosion. And an explosion, you're going to lose the mission. So to go through the very basics of how a rocket engine works. So I'm going to go through, first of all, you have the fuel injector, and then you have the combustion chamber, and then you have the throat, and then you have the nozzle at the bottom, which everybody sees. So the whole idea is the fuel will go through the fuel injector. 70% of the propellant will be sent through cooling tubes that were on the outside of the combustion chamber. Now that's very important to remember, because that was needed in order to absorb the thermal energy that was being produced inside the combustion chamber. In other words, the controlled explosion that is necessary to eventually lift the rocket off the launch pad. Now, those tubes apparently were breaking down, and that became very apparent on Apollo 6, which was the second launch of Saturn V and also the second unmanned launch of Saturn V. So those tubes were breaking down. So they actually tried to perform a full power launch with Saturn V, but it didn't quite work, and they almost lost the mission. I mean, the Pogo effect from the Saturn V, the launch of Apollo 6, they almost lost the mission with that, so they had to power back the engines. So the basic premise is, and he goes through this in very, very great detail, that the cooling system that they were using could not be used at full power. So if you cannot use the F-1 engines at full power, then you no longer have the necessary thrust to get an Apollo payload into Earth parking orbit. And if you can't do that, then you have no Apollo moon landings. So that's the basic premise. So I went from there, and I just started looking deeper and deeper into this. After the ending of the Apollo program, it's very interesting to know that the cooling system was never used again. And to this day, NASA has now referred to using a Soviet cooling system instead of the American-style cooling system for its rocket engines. So that's another point that has to be remembered. So that's basically my premise right now. And so, I'm prepared to answer questions if anybody has any.
Thanks very much, Randy. And you've basically made two separate points here. One is the navigation of Apollo 13, and the other is the issue to do with the Saturn V F-1 engine.
This is the official page for NASA for the F-1 engines. It also has slightly different height at 36 miles, at 6,000 miles per hour, which is less than the 4Gs that they were claiming. There's the second engine cut off at 109 miles, and there's the final shut off at 118 miles. That's one official version. This is the other official version right up here, saying that it's only 36 miles at 6,000 miles an hour, and at 42 miles, you're almost at 12,000 miles an hour, and that's a huge difference. And if you want to see the detail that NASA has now given on this website, here's the PDF file for the F-1 rocket engines, and if you click it, this is what you get.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that very, very clear that they are actively deleting information all of the time.
There's a couple of other things that I do want to point out. I've been asked repeatedly, well, if it wasn't 1.5 million pounds per thrust per each engine, and that's 5 engines, that's 7.5 million pounds of thrust, right? Then I've been asked repeatedly, well, how much thrust then was produced? And that's a question that is very difficult to answer. In fact, I haven't seen a rebuttal to the article I just talked about that Russian scientist. I haven't seen anything about that. But what I'm repeatedly asked is, well, what was the actual thrust? Well, there is a hint up to the actual thrust of the F-1 engines, but you have to go back to 1959 because Rocketdyne was the producer of the F-1 engines. And this was, of course, years before the Apollo program had officially started. Rocketdyne was able to get less than, it was between 900,000 to 1 million pounds of thrust per engine. Now, that's a static test. And that data was out long before the Apollo missions were put into effect. So I find that data may be somewhat reliable. That's the only reliable data that we can go on so far. Because remember, all the telemetry information for the Apollo missions were destroyed by NASA's own admission. Because at that point, they had nothing to hide. There was no reason for them to be developing the F-1 engine. They were just experimenting. And they were trying to build, there was no moon mission in the works at that point. That didn't come out until 1961. And that's basically Bill Casing comes into play because Bill Casing was working for Rocketdyne and he was privy to the actual data. And even though they got 1 million pounds of thrust out of one F-1 engine, we're only talking, I think it was about 200 milliseconds that they got that thrust. So it wasn't sustainable. So you have to get into some guesstimation here. And if I was to hazard a guess, I would basically say the actual output of the F-1 engines was between 500 to 900,000 pounds of thrust, far less than total 7.5 million pounds of thrust that NASA claims they were able to accomplish, which would be necessary to get that 46-ton payload into Earth parking orbit. So that's the point I wanted to make there.
Can I'll come to your picture there that you got there in a second, Randy. I mean, I remember reading in your book about the guy that was a NASA engineer or some engineer that was on site at the Apollo 11 launch who was tasked with going to cine camera film the launch from literally the launch pad till it went out of sight.
Phil Palacio, he worked for IBM and he was on contract to NASA. He worked directly in the Apollo program. He worked on a couple of missions. And he had shown up that morning to launch for Apollo 11, which is what you're seeing here. And he had his Super 8 film camera. And, he was a staunch believer. Of course, he was working for NASA, and he was very proud at that moment. And he wanted to be there to catch an historical occasion. I mean, hell, who wouldn't, right? What's interesting about his film at the time is that he shot the film of the launch continuously. There's no breaks. So for a full 2 minutes, he caught the actual launch from the pad to the claimed altitude of 42 miles, as NASA has said. He became very suspicious about the program himself. Talk about whistleblowers. This is the biggest whistleblower I've come across so far. He wanted to find out exactly what was going on, so he had submitted his film to some researchers, which I do talk about in the book, and they did a complete analysis of this film. In order for the scientists who were doing the analysis, they needed to find out if this film was authentic. So they went to great lengths to authenticate the film and then make sure that there was no mysterious splices in the film, splices that would really alter dramatically the outcome. And they verified that the film itself was authentic. The photo here that you're looking at right now is still from that photo, and I'm going to refer to Scott in a moment because Scott and Bob Williams from Apollo Detectives have done some very good work with this film. I just want to sort of say that this man, Phil Palacio, had nothing at all to invest in questioning the Apollo missions. He was proud to be a part of that. So for him to come forward, and as Scott will talk about in a second, his film shows conclusively that Apollo 11 did not reach the assigned altitude 2 minutes after launch, which is very significant. In fact, it was far lower. It was not only, I think it was about 3 times lower, the speed was 3 times lower. And what you're looking at right here is cumulus clouds, which is incredible because if that turns out to be cumulus clouds, which are far lower than the first stage separation, cumulus clouds will go up to about 30,000 feet, but these are clearly not at 30,000 feet. But to go with the official version for a second, on the morning of the Apollo 11 launch, NASA said that there was high cirrus clouds. Now, high cirrus clouds don't normally go higher than 25, maybe 30,000 feet. They can reach 40,000 feet, but it's rare. And I want to bring this point up. I want to make this point very clear, is that it's very interesting that NASA doesn't list the altitude of the high cirrus clouds. But interestingly enough, they do list the altitude of the cirrus clouds that are for the launch of Apollo 13 and the launch for Apollo 15, which is 25,000 feet. And here's the other point that's very interesting too. It was calculated, and I put this in the book, when Apollo 11 when it punched through the cirrus clouds, it was not at the altitude that it should have been. But that kind of definitively shows, again, there's another point of view and another angle that shows that Apollo 11 was not where it should have been even 1 minute after launch, let alone 2 minutes. So I just wanted to put that in before. Now, let Scott now talk about this slide here and the work that him and Bob Williams are doing, which is really excellent. I'm actually going to be putting their work in my second book, which I'll get to later.
Great.